Esther as Gog and Magog, timeline, video number 1. Hello, everyone. My name is Persohn. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church, which is my email address, or in the comments below if you like. If you interact with this video in any way, YouTube might recommend it on to somebody else, but who knows? I'm happy to be back on this topic of Esther as Gog and Magog again. Let me just state my position before we hop into some detail work here, some timeline things. It is my position, and I'm not alone, by the way, I didn't invent this, that the book of Esther is the fulfillment of Ezekiel's Gog and Magog prophecy. Now, in order to do that, we've got to establish some history, some background, and so on. So the purpose of today's video is to have a little look at some of the history of those days. Now, if you tried to make sense of the history of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and the prophets of Zechariah and Haggai, Malachi, I am on your side. This is a complicated time in history. There's a lot going on. So what we're going to try to do here is to give you kind of a panoramic view and help you to understand what's going on. And this is by no means, it's not hard to understand, but it's by no means in the front of most of our minds. So what we'll do is I'll flick you over to my PowerPoint here, make some comments, and you'll see me flicking back and forth as we go, just checking on my video, my technology and everything. My venerable Dell over here is on its last leg, so I better be sure to replace it this week. So let's just come down here and have a look at this map. Now we're really looking at a period of time called the post-exilic period. What does that mean? That's the period after the exile, And there's a lot going on in this time, a huge amount. We begin with all the way to the left of your screen where we start with Cyrus, and then we have Artaxerxes Longimanus, and by the way, I apologize in advance to any Persian speaker. We are going to mess these up for sure. Now, on the bottom of the screen, you have various characters that appear in and out of these passages. We won't get to all of them, but let's have a look at the top before we get to our next slide. So just upon the return from the exile. So what does that actually mean, and why is that important? So God's people were in Babylon, and that was the first of Daniel's 4 kingdoms. And then after this time, the second of Daniel's 4 kingdoms becomes dominant. We begin to see that. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. And we're seeing the beginning of this time when God used the Persians to care for his covenant people. Then following this would be Greece and then Rome. So we're going to have a little look at the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire and gather some of these important people that we've talked about because we're heading towards the book of Esther. So Cyrus and Darius are co-regents in a complicated relationship from the years. You can look this up, by the way. This is all standard history from approximately 539 to 529. Now, some historians and chronologers will shift this by a year. Either way, this has to do with the count on the year 0, but certainly there's no conflict about the very close to these periods of time. Now, after this, and Cyrus appear in the Bible as the liberator of the Jews under Babylon, the issuer of a decree to go back to the land, and so on. Now, after this, we have Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes, also known as Cambyses. Now, see, this is one of the reasons we have a problem with these things, is that the kings are known of different names over time. And this is from 529 to 522. So again, we're going from back on into the future. So 539 to 529, now 529 to 522. And we see an interaction with him in the scriptures. Subsequent videos will overlay scriptures with these maps. Just today, we're just getting the panorama of history and locating our characters. This is also occurs with the first return to the land. This is occurring about this time. Now, after this, we have another King Darius. This is not the Darius of Daniel. The Darius of Daniel is the first one all the way to your left, but this is another Darius, Darius I or Darius I, 526 to 486 BC. Okay, so we're coming up along in time a little bit, and we have a bit of interaction with him, which we'll see in the future. And then we get to 2 very interesting and important kings here. One is Xerxes I, or Ahasuerus, 486 to 464 BC. And then you have Artaxerxes Longimanus, 464 to 424. Now, if you can hold just this thought in your mind, the next slide is going to collapse the top section and then start to show some of the biblical characters that we know and some of the stories and try to place them along this timeline. Because what we want to do here is confirm that the book of Esther fits in a time and a place where people who were aware of Ezekiel's prophecy, or maybe even knew Ezekiel, might still have been alive when the Gog and Magog events of Esther took place. This is very, very interesting, and it's instructive. Then we can look at the book of Esther and see some qualities of the land and the nation at the time, find out where Esther fits, and we can refer back to this map that I've just shown you, this chronology, several times. Now, in the next slide I'm going to show you, we'll collapse the top section, and you'll start seeing some of the biblical characters that you're aware of in history. I want to go back just one more time here to this slide. I missed a point. I can see at the corner of my eye. You'll notice down in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a reference to, I think it's Guamata, or also called Pseudo-Smerdis. I tell you what, I butchered these names. But he rules for just a short period of time in 522 BC, between Darius the First, just before he comes on board. And look, if you want a bit of history and intrigue, you can look him up and find out. There's lots of intrigue, by the way, with the kings of Persia. And let me say, ladies and gentlemen, history is complicated. When you look back and you see these sort of big pictures, you think, okay, then this king and then that king and this and no and so on. These things are as complicated then as they are now, the transitions of government and so on and what goes on, and some of it's pretty fascinating reading. Okay, so on to our slightly modified slide, because what we're attempting to do is now to see some of the biblical characters, some of the names we might know, and try to put them along this timeline. This is very helpful, and certainly it was helpful for me when I did this and just sort of repointed myself along the way. So let's start again on the left. Now you notice to make room, I collapsed the king's names along the top so they're not as easy to read. 539 BC, we have the decree of Cyrus, and this is spoken about in several different places in the scripture. So again, in a future slide, we'll pop those up and try to find a way maybe to make it easy for you to take it and print it and have it with you. I don't know. I don't want it death by PowerPoint, but there we go. And then 538 BC, the first return begins. And this continues on into the next reign. Now, we have heard about a man named Zerubbabel, and there's actually he gets a place in Zechariah chapter 4. Remember this, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. When he's looking at the rubble that's he's going to have to organize to build the temple wall. And a co-prophet of his, or a prophet that God raises up at the same time, is Haggai. Now, the prophet Zechariah is the one who records the events of Zerubbabel and Haggai, just as we're moving a little bit farther on. Now, a very, very critical element here is that in 516 BC, the temple is completed. This is extremely important. This is probably the pinnacle of all of this time period that we're looking at, but the temple is fully completed. Now, prior to the completion of the temple, the people sacrificed in altars and they kept the feast. You can read that. You read it in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah as he chronicles that, and you can see what's going on as this rebuilding is taking place. It's really quite marvelous. And so certainly the temple is back in function fully. It's built. This is the second temple. This is the beginning, if you will, of what we call the Second Temple era. I would submit to you the Second Temple era begins with the return of the exiles, but it's probably just a moot point. The thing that's important here is that the New Testament events all occur in the Second Temple era. Every book in the Bible in the New Testament is written in the Second Temple era. It is really critical to know. I've got a book I've talked about here in the past, a couple of them, that point to the fact that, and give a strong case to say that every single book in the New Testament was written before the fall of Jerusalem while the Second Temple was working. There's, of course, John A.T. Robinson's excellent classic work on redating the New Testament, and another one I've got a little bit more modern. We've talked about that. Okay, so this is this era, this period of time. So let's flick back to our slide now here. The Second Temple era, we're seeing the beginning of that period. Now, we come along to the reign of Xerxes, Ahasuerus. And we note that Esther she begins to reign as queen. Actually, Esther begins to reign early on in Ahasuerus' reign, which is 486. But the real work of Esther that we read about in the Bible occurs between 478 and 474 BC. 478 and 474 BC. So this is this really curious time frame. So just to be sure that that we've got some possible numbers here, we'll just pop the calculator up here, and I'm going to take 539 minus 478, and we're going to come up with 61 years. Okay, so 61 years after the return of the exiles, Esther's the drama in the book of Esther actually begins to happen, begins to occur, and it goes on for a few years. And so from 478 to 474. So this is really, really critical. We can now look at this time and we can say, all right, Mordecai, who was certainly a very senior man, an older man, when you look at the book of Esther, was very likely one of the exiles. Or no, he wasn't an exile. He was still in Persia, but he may have been, or he was very likely around when the decree to return to the land occurs. Also, the decrees that took place in the book of Esther affect Ezra and Nehemiah and their work afterwards and their ability to do their work. So this is really, really important to understand. This book of Esther fits right here in a timeline now that isn't so distant. It's not so magical or mysterious. We've just slotted Esther right into history. Let's go back to our slide here, because some of this is might be making a bit more sense as we review this here. So we have various trips of Ezra and Nehemiah back and forth into Jerusalem and so on and so forth, doing their work, and the prophet Malachi. So 457 BC, Ezra returns to Jerusalem. In 444 BC, so a little while after that, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, and the best dating possible for the book of Malachi is a little bit after that. And it's understood that the book of Malachi is the last book in the Bible. The dating around that is always just a little bit ambiguous, but I'm sure the last book in the Old Testament chronologically. It is the book that that talks about the upcoming John the Baptist and then the Messiah, a very important prophecy. So having a look at this now, we've just been able to get ourselves to a place where we can start seeing how these various characters could easily have been in this place in this time. So let's just take a quick moment here and think about the implications of this. Oftentimes people will talk about the Gog and Magog events as not having been fulfilled. And I get that. I'm sympathetic to that problem. One of the problems that you have is that they're not aware of the connection that I'm talking to you about here. They kind of are a little bit muddy. Sometimes they're just basically regurgitating traditional positions that have been held for a very long time. And by the way, there are varying positions amongst Jews and amongst Christians and so on about this time period also. I'm putting forward what I believe is the most logical and the best, and we have referenced earlier articles on this topic. But you certainly get that. You certainly get people saying, all right, let's take all of these literal elements that Ezekiel talks about in the Gog and Magog story, and because it does not look like this event has been fulfilled, let's push them off into the yet-to-be-fulfilled future. If the events of Gog and Magog have not been fulfilled in history, then yes, they're going to have to be pushed off some other time, some other place. This would be a really big problem for people like me who say, no, all prophecy has been fulfilled. Now you say that why then is Gog and Magog referenced in the book of Revelation? Certainly the book of Revelation was future to the one who wrote it, even though it might not be a long future, but they must be looking for this to happen. Where is the nation? How could the nation of Gog and Magog, is this Ezekiel's reference? Is this whatever? We have to understand in the book of Revelation that pictures from the Old Testament are reused and rebuilt and refactored to give us a prophetic panorama of what is taking place at the final judgment at the end of Daniel's fourth kingdom, which is the Roman kingdom. Just a quick reminder, Daniel he's in captivity. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He doesn't know what the dream is. Daniel talks about the dream, interprets the dream, and he's really talking about God's people, God's kingdom. He says that God's people will be under the care of 4 nations or 4 empires, starting with Babylon, moving to Persia, then to Greece, and finally to Rome. We know those looking back. The Babylonian Empire that has passed. By the time we get to our slides, Babylon is in history. We're seeing the beginning of the Second Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. We're seeing this time. Now, when you have a look at this, you say, okay, now all of a sudden this starts to work. As we draw in elements of the book of Esther, and we start to realize that the book of Esther could only really have fit in this time period, which was kind of historically we know, then you begin to say, what about the prophetic language in the book of Esther? What about the prophetic language in the book of Ezekiel referring to Gog and Magog? Could those things talk about events there in prophet speak, prophetic language? And yes, they can. And I'm very excited to continue this. So as we follow on to this topic here, we probably need to do an other timeline map, just dropping some scriptures in place so you can kind of see those things. But overall, we now have a good foundation to dig a little bit more into the events of Esther, the prophetic language that Ezekiel uses, and why the story of Esther is the fulfillment, at least in my opinion, the best case for it is the fulfillment of the Gog and Magog prophecy. Fascinating that it's even possible that Mordecai himself may have, we don't know this for sure, may have known Ezekiel and heard Ezekiel reiterate that very prophecy or been there when Ezekiel preached it. Who knows? And Mordecai's looking at this event saying, this is it. This is this event. And if that's the case, wow, we've got some very interesting conclusions to draw. So I'm going to just flick back to this slide here quickly. Get this in your head. We have Cyrus, Ahasuerus, Darius, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes, all names that are referenced in, I think all but one, I think they all are referenced in the scripture in one way or another. In the upcoming video, we'll drop some scriptures below, and we'll begin to see these events in a little bit more detail as we continue on to this topic. So there you go. My name is Persohn. I hope you enjoyed this overview of history. This is by no means controversial, well-known history. You can look it up, test me on the dates, and be happy to interact with you because Bible chronology is difficult stuff. Come back again. I will populate this playlist, and we'll see how we go. God bless. Talk again soon.